I wasn't in a good place that February, and that's the plain truth of it. I was 41 years old, a county park trail foreman with a good back, steady hands, and a life that looked organized on paper while coming apart in every room that mattered. I trusted Pulaski's, weather reports, fuel mix ratios, and time cards. I trusted things you could carry, sharpen, schedule, or fix. I did not trust stories. I did not trust hunches. I especially did not trust hope when it came dressed up as maybe next month from attorneys who billed in 6-minute slices and spoke like fathers and sons were parcels to be routed. By then, my divorce had been final long enough for everybody else to stop asking how I was doing, and short enough that every answer still came out wrong. My son, Eli, had turned into a blue text bubble that stayed on read when it stayed on anything at all. At first, he'd answer once a week, then once every 2 weeks, then just thumbs-up reactions like he was acknowledging a bank alert. I kept telling myself, teenagers go quiet. Boys his age pull inward. He'll come around. Don't make it worse by pushing. That was the clean theory. The evidence was a calendar with crossed-out weekends and a duffel bag by my front door that sat packed for visits that never happened. The failure was me, standing in my kitchen at 8:30 on a Friday, listening to the ice maker kick on in an empty house. When Pine Barrow State Forest posted off-season emergency overtime after the blowdown, I put my name in before my coffee cooled. The official reason was staffing shortage and hazard mitigation. The real reason was I needed to be where work ended at dark and when no one asked me if I'd tried family therapy yet, like I was forgetting to rotate my truck tires. Pine Barrow came with an inherited ranger cabin from my dad's side, a narrow place on pilings above the creek with a stove that popped when it got hot, and a porch rail polished smooth by 30 winters of elbows. It was the last place I remembered feeling like a father instead of a legal problem. Eli had been 10 when we spent 4 days there in July rain, making pancakes too thick to flip and naming chipmunks like we had all the time in the world. The February blowdown was not dramatic in one big moment. That was the hard part. It was cumulative, methodical weather, the kind that does not care what week you're already having. Wet snow first, heavy enough to load every limb, then sleet, which glazed the load into weight, then wind from the west for 2 straight nights, gusting hard through the saddle and dropping old-growth firs like matchsticks on the Ridgeglass Trail switchbacks. By the time the front finally moved east, the forest looked less destroyed than rearranged by a giant hand with no interest in our trail plan. Trunks lay across tread in crossed angles. Root wads lifted stones the size of coolers. Mud swallowed culverts. Volunteer crews had to be walked out twice because side paths sloughed into creek cuts. Dispatch started using the phrase blocked corridor, and that was exactly what Ridgeglass had become. Not a trail, not woods, just a jammed artery of wood, ice, and soft ground where every step asked a favor from your knees. I moved into the cabin with 2 duffels, Juniper's food bin, and a milk crate full of saw files. Juniper was my old red-tick hound, 12 years and slowing, with white on her muzzle, and a patience I had not earned. She still slept by the door every night like the world had shape and purpose. My days settled into a rhythm that felt functional and hollow at the same time. Thermos coffee at dawn while I checked the latest forecast and marked hazard zones on laminated maps. Saw maintenance at noon no matter what else went sideways, because a poorly kept chain will humble you in front of younger men fast. Quiet grief at dusk while the stove clicked and Juniper dreamed on the rug, her paws moving like she was still running rabbits through my father's pasture. By the second week of February, my body knew each segment of that day before my mind caught up. I'd shoulder tools, walk ridge miles, tag danger trees, call in coordinates, and keep my voice level on the radio like I was standing in sunshine on dry gravel. Then I'd come back to the cabin and stare too long at the shelf where Eli used to line up polished rocks he insisted were arrowheads. I ate standing up more nights than I sat down. I stopped turning on the little battery radio because songs made everything feel personal. I slept in 2-hour blocks and woke thinking I had missed something urgent, only to realize the urgent thing was always the same. My kid was growing up somewhere else, and I had no useful tool for that. Supervisor calls were brisk that week. Dana from district headquarters had a good way of sounding calm while listing bad facts. We've got 6 volunteers sidelined, 2 trailheads closed, and county asking for reopening estimates before the next board meeting, she said one morning, paper shuffling in the background. I need your numbers by Friday, not optimistic numbers, real numbers. Real numbers are ugly, I said, looking out at sleet needling the porch steps. Ridgeglass main line is a log jam from marker 3 to 7. I can clear what's safe with 2 people and hand tools, but there are trunks we can't buck without destabilizing the slope. Copy that. You still good to stay on site? I'm here. Appreciate it, Travis. The call clicked off, and appreciation hung in the room like an extra coat I didn't need. I tried Eli again that afternoon from the truck turnout where service came and went in 1-bar flashes. I kept it simple the way the counsellor had suggested during the one joint session we managed before scheduling, and resentment ground it down. Hey, bud, it's Dad. I'm up at Pine Barrow for a few weeks doing storm cleanup. Cabin's still standing somehow. If you want, when road's clear, we could do a day hike on the lower spur. Easy one. No pressure, just if you want. Love you. I listened to myself breathing after the beep, then ended the call, and sat there with the phone face down on my thigh. I wasn't looking for a dramatic reconciliation. I would have taken a one-word reply. I would have taken a sarcastic meme. Silence can be louder than anger if it goes on long enough. Nights at Pine Barrow were usually full of ordinary sounds, branches ticking the roof, creek water knocking stones together, owls working the far draw. After the blowdown, even the ordinary felt muffled for a while, like the storm had packed insulation into the whole forest. The cabin lamp made a warm circle on the table, and beyond that circle, everything blurred into dark fir trunks and damp snow. I'd spread maps, mark closures, and do that mental math every foreman does. If I move crew to the South Loop, I lose a day on Ridgeglass. If I stay on Ridgeglass, the campground connector remains blocked. If another system rolls in, all forecasts are fiction anyway. I stood one evening at the sink with cold well water running over my knuckles and had a stretch of thought I couldn't talk my way around. I am tired in ways sleep does not touch. I am carrying boards and chains and fuel and radio batteries all day, and none of it weighs what one missed. Phone call ways. I know how to clear deadfall. I know how to read lean and tension and escape route. I know where to stand when a trunk rolls. I do not know where to stand with my own son so he doesn't feel cornered. I do not know how to repair trust when every attempt sounds like instruction. I can decompose a trail problem into sections, crews, and hours. This thing at home stays whole and heavy. The next morning came blue and hard cold, the kind that makes metal burn your palm for a second before your glove catches up. I left before sunrise with a thermos and a notebook, planning to assess the main blockage on Ridgeglass from marker 2 upward. Juniper stayed at the cabin under protest, giving me that old dog look that says she has seen my plans fail before and will forgive me anyway. Frost crusted the boardwalk sections. My breath hung low over the tread. A woodpecker tapped once somewhere above me and then went quiet. At marker 3, the trail narrowed between 2 boulders and opened into a stand of younger fir. That was where I stopped and listened, not because I heard danger, but because I didn't hear what should have been there. No squirrel chatter, no jay complaints, no wind through upper needles though the tops were moving. Just the creek down left and my own boots settling in damp duff. A deer stood maybe 30 yards off, half screened by salal. It looked at me and didn't bolt. It just held still, ears forward, calm as a farm animal watching someone fix fence. I remember taking one step and feeling the oddest steadiness settle over me, like the woods were occupied but not hostile, watched but not judged. By late morning, I looped back to the cabin edge to grab wedges and more bar oil before tackling the upper mess. I cut across the side of camp where I kept split rounds and a blue tarp pinned over kindling space that had been empty the night before. Under that tarp sat a neat stack of dry sticks and thumb-thick splits, sorted by size like someone had done it with patient hands in dim light. Not dumped, stacked. Bark side out, tinder to one side, twigs snapped clean and bundled with a strip of cedar bark. I stood there longer than I needed to, one glove still on, one glove in my teeth, trying to run that sight through any practical framework I had left. Volunteer prank? No tracks near the woodpile except mine and Juniper's older prints crusted over. Neighbour passing through. Nearest winter resident was 3 miles down Forest Road and had a bad hip. Sleepwalking foreman with excellent fire-building habits? Unlikely, though not impossible. I laughed once, short and dry, because the alternative was to feel what I was already feeling. I'm sleep-deprived enough to thank a pile of sticks now, I said out loud to no one, and then I did it anyway. Thank you. The words disappeared into the cold, and for the first time in months, I did not feel alone inside my own life. That unsettled me more than if I'd heard a branch crack behind me. I knew how to handle nerves, and I knew how to handle weather, but gratitude aimed at an empty stand of trees put me in country I didn't have a map for. I pulled my glove back on, checked the tarp corners twice like that could restore normal order, and carried the wedges and bar oil to the truck with the careful, deliberate pace of a man pretending he wasn't rattled. I ate lunch on the tailgate 30 minutes later, one boot on the bumper, notebook open across my knee. The sandwich tasted like cold mustard and cardboard. I wrote times, temperatures, rough dimensions of the main blockage, and then, because not writing it felt dishonest, I added one line in the margin. Kindling appeared overnight, dry and sorted, source unknown. I stared at that sentence until my eyes blurred. I crossed out appeared and wrote present at 10:40 hours. Neutral wording, something a foreman could defend. By early afternoon, the sky flattened to a dull pewter, and the thaw started, slow and mean. Snow on the upper limbs turned to heavy drops that hit my jacket hood one at a time, each one loud as a coin landing on a countertop. Ridge glass from marker 3 to 4 was worse than it looked from below. A wind-thrown fir had twisted down across 2 younger trunks, and the root plate from a second tree had lifted half the tread into a tilted shelf of mud and stone. I set a hazard ribbon, checked lean angles, then stood there with my Pulaski handle in both hands and felt that old helplessness creep in. A trail problem ought to be a sequence. Identify risk, choose approach, clear what you can, flag what you can't. But that day, every section seemed to lead into another section that was just as bad. I climbed over one snag to find 2 more. I cut a drain to pull water off the tread and watched another seep open 10 yards uphill. I was working, but I was not getting ahead. That was the same feeling I'd had for months with Eli, and recognizing it out there in the mud took the wind out of me in a way the climb hadn't. I sat on a stump near marker 4 and let my shoulders drop for the first time all day. The forest was wet and grey and close around me, all bark and moss and breath cloud. My gloves steamed at the cuffs. Somewhere below, the creek kept its own steady argument with stone. I remember thinking, clear as if I'd said it aloud, I can carry weight all day, but I can't carry distance. Not that kind. Not the kind between me and my boy. I told myself I was being dramatic from poor sleep, which might have been partly true. Then I reached for my phone out of habit, checked for service, and saw the same blank bars I'd seen all morning. No signal, no new message, no small mercy. I put the phone away and rubbed my eyes with the heel of my hand until colours flashed. When I looked up, a raven was standing on the trail about 20 feet away, head cocked, calm as a clerk waiting for me to finish paperwork. It hopped once, glanced toward the uphill side and lifted off without urgency. By 3 o'clock, I'd done what I could safely do alone, and that was the part that stung. I liked finishing things. I liked the moment a blocked line opened and you could see clear tread where chaos had been. There was none of that waiting for me. I tagged 3 more hazards, marked a turnaround point for volunteers, and headed downslope with a dull ache of unfinished work between my shoulder blades. At the cabin, I set tools to dry, fed Juniper early, and called Dana while there was a breath of service through the kitchen window. "Give me honest numbers," she said. I heard keyboard clicks and somebody laughing faintly in the background at district. "Honest numbers are we keep ridge glass closed through the weekend," I said. "I can open sections, not the corridor. Too much bind, too much soft ground. We force it, somebody gets hurt." A pause. Then, "All right, I'll take the heat on the board call. Document everything. Photos, coordinates, the whole package." "Copy." "You sound wiped, Travis. You good to keep solo another 48? "I'm functional." That wasn't the question. I looked at Juniper, who was watching me from the doorway with her bowl empty and her ears tilted forward. "Yeah," I said after a beat. "I'm good enough." "Good enough is a real category this month," Dana said. "Check in by 700. When I ended the call, the kitchen felt smaller. Functional. Good enough. Words that did their job and asked for nothing else. I leaned on the counter and listened to Juniper lap water, steady and noisy and alive. Then I laughed at myself, low and tired. I'd thanked a pile of sticks before lunch and gotten defensive about it with no one. If that wasn't a sign I needed one full night of sleep, I didn't know what was. Twilight came early behind cloud cover. The cold sharpened again as soon as the light thinned, and I took Juniper out for a short loop along the camp edge before full dark. Her joints were stiff if she lay too long, but once she got moving, she still had that old hound rhythm, nose down, tail level, checking every familiar scent like she was reading headlines. The ground by the shed was a churn of boot prints and old paw marks in half-frozen mud. Beyond that, where the tree line began, the surface held a thin crust that cracked under my weight with a soft, ceramic sound. Juniper stopped halfway to the woodpile and lifted her head. Not alert in the hard way, not hair up, not tense, just attentive. Her tail gave 2 easy thumps against my leg. She looked toward the firs, sat down, and kept looking, breathing through her nose in short, quiet pulls. I followed her gaze and saw nothing except trunks and the pale strip of snow in the understory. "You see a deer?" I asked her. She didn't move. More tail thumps, friendly, almost expectant. I listened. The usual dusk chatter was absent again. No scolding jays, no squirrel rustle overhead. Even the creek seemed farther away for a minute, like somebody had closed a door between us and it. There was no sense of threat in it, none at all. The feeling was closer to standing in a church before a service starts, when people lower their voices without being asked. Juniper stayed seated, calm as a dog, waiting for a familiar truck to pull in. I took 3 slow steps toward the trees and stopped. The cold smelled like wet cedar, turned soil, and something warm animal that was old and clean, not rank. A shape shifted far back between two trunks, tall enough that my first thought was broken branch shadow. Then it was still again, and blended with bark and dusk until I couldn't trust what I'd seen. Juniper's ears relaxed. She gave a soft huff and looked up at me as if to say, "Well, there you go." We stood there maybe 30 seconds, maybe 2 minutes. Time got slippery in that quiet. I felt watched, yes, but not sized up, not measured for weakness. Watched the way a neighbor watches from his porch when your truck won't start, deciding whether to bring jumper cables before you ask. I realized my hands were open at my sides instead of clenched. "All right," I said softly, to the tree line more than the dog. "Evening." No answer but the smallest movement of a limb high overhead, and then, gradually, the forest sounds returned in layers. A drip from the eaves. Creak noise rising back into place. One distant chickadee call, thin and bright. Juniper stood, stretched each back leg in turn, and turned for the cabin like her business was complete. Inside, I toweled her paws and set a pan of chili on the stove. The cabin warmed in steady increments, metal ticking as it expanded, glass frosting at the corners. I sat at the table with my notebook again, pen hovering. For a long minute, I considered leaving the page clean. Then, I wrote what happened as plainly as I could. 17:35 hours. Juniper sat at tree line. Calm behavior, repeated tail thump. No distress. Ambient woods unusually quiet for approximately 2 minutes. Possible large movement observed in fir stand. No confirmation. I added scent noted, cedar / wet earth / animal musk, non-predatory. That last phrase looked ridiculous and exact at the same time. By full dark, I had convinced myself of 3 different practical explanations and knocked down each one. A passing elk could account for scent, but not Juniper's posture. She respected elk, didn't greet them. A neighbor dog could explain her tail, but no dog in those woods moved that high between trunks. Fatigue could explain my perception, but not the kindling, not the deer, not this repeating pocket of stillness that arrived like a held breath and left without fuss. I set the notebook aside and carried my bowl to the porch. The night was cold enough to bite my teeth through the steam. Fir silhouettes stacked against a low cloud ceiling, and somewhere up the drainage, a branch settled with a muffled knock. I ate half the chili and stopped. Appetite gone, not from fear, but from a strange tenderness I didn't know where to put. I had spent months bracing for bad news, in every silence. This silence felt different. It didn't ask anything from me. It didn't accuse. It just stayed nearby. When I finally stood to go in, I saw one more thing at the edge of the porch light. 3 short sticks laid side by side on the top step, ends aligned, dry despite the damp. Not firewood this time. More like a marker, simple and deliberate. I looked toward the trees and let out a breath I felt all the way in my chest. "Thank you," I said again, quieter than before. Juniper leaned against my leg, warm and solid, and we went inside together. Inside, I shut the door with my heel and stood there with my hand on the latch longer than made sense. Juniper circled twice on her bed, sighed, and folded herself down with the practiced care of an old dog who knew exactly where her joints argued. I took the 3 sticks from my coat pocket and laid them on the table beside the notebook. They were all about the same length, each one snapped clean, no ragged fibers, no rot in the middle. Whoever had set them on the step had chosen dry wood in weather that had soaked every loose thing in camp. I touched one with my fingertip and got that same odd, steady feeling I'd had at the tree line. I told myself to leave it alone and get sleep. Instead, I boiled water, made tea I didn't want, and sat at the table while the stove ticked. I measured the sticks against the edge of a topo map, wrote down lengths, then laughed at myself in a way that would have embarrassed me if anyone had been there to hear it. I was a grown man with a divorce file thick enough to stop a door, and I was cataloguing porch twigs like evidence in a crime lab. If anybody had walked in right then, I'd have handed them the pen and asked for a second opinion. I finally slept, close to midnight, light off, cabin dark except for the banked orange in the stove window. At some point, I woke and listened. No scrape at the walls, no steps, just creek water under ice edges and juniper breathing in the next room. Calm sounds, ordinary sounds. I slept again before I could start inventing explanations. Morning came pale and brittle. Frost glazed the porch boards and turned each knot in the wood white. The 3 sticks were gone from the table because I had moved them to a coffee can by the door, though for a second I had a sharp, foolish thought that they'd moved themselves. I drank coffee standing up, then called dispatch at 0648 from the uphill corner of the porch where one bar usually showed. Pine Barrow, this is Travis. Starting ridge glass assessment from marker 2. Solo this morning. Copy, Travis, the dispatcher said. Any overnight incidents at camp? I looked at the can by the door and kept my voice even. No incidents, quiet night. Roger that. Check in by noon. Juniper watched me lace my boots and gave one soft complaint when I reached for the leash. You're coming, I told her. Slow pace, short miles. Her tail tapped once against the doorframe like she approved the plan and had known I'd fold. The first half-mile felt like every other hard, cold morning at Pine Barrow. Damp air needling my sinuses, mud, top-crusted and slick beneath. Old storm damage leaning at angles my body measured without conscious thought. But once we crossed marker 3, my attention kept snagging on small things that didn't fit yesterday's map in my head. A branch tangle I'd stepped over the afternoon before was now laid parallel to the tread in a tidy line, opening a clean footpath. 2 trail flags I had tied low on alder stems were retied higher, both at nearly the same shoulder height mark, not snug, tails trimmed short. No boot tracks around them except my own from the previous day and a blurred print from Juniper. I crouched, touched the knot, and felt the bark strip still damp but tight, as if it had been cinched by hands that understood tension. I took photos, spoke notes into my phone, and tried to keep my thinking inside lines I recognized. Maybe a volunteer had come through early. Maybe Dana sent somebody without telling me. Maybe I had tied those flags higher and remembered it wrong. The first theory failed when I checked the work log at 08:15 and saw no crew assigned. The second failed because my radio stayed quiet all morning except for a weather update. The third failed because I found one of my old knot ends on the ground where I'd dropped it yesterday, exactly where it should have been if I had tied low and cut away. By the third morning after the worst wind, I had started checking the same 10 spots every shift, not out of fear, but because something patient was happening, and I needed to know its pattern. Near marker 4.5, the trail bent around a cedar that had come down at an angle days earlier, roots still gripping a lifted plate of soil and stone. I had marked it as a 2-person cut with rigging, because there was no safe way for me to move it alone. Now the cedar lay 6 feet uphill from where I'd tagged it, resting in a stable notch between 2 stumps, clear of tread, no drag groove in the mud, no chain bite marks, no frayed strap fibers, nothing. It looked as if someone had picked up a length of wet bridge timber and set it gently aside to protect the slope. I stood there with my tape measure hanging from one hand and felt my old framework crack another inch. If a machine had done that, I'd see approach scars. If a team had done it by hand, I'd see footprints, tool marks, broken understory from repeated passes. The huckleberry stems around the new resting place were bent, not crushed. The young saplings nearest the trail were untouched, all standing straight with frost on their tips. Juniper moved ahead 10 yards, sniffed once, and sat. Not rigid, not alert in a warning way. Just sat and looked uphill into the firs with her ears easy and her tail making slow, steady taps against wet leaves. I followed her gaze and smelled cedar pitch, black soil, and that same warm animal scent from the night before, clean and deep, like sun-warmed wool brought into cold air. "Morning," I said, and heard my own voice come out quieter than a normal greeting. Nothing answered, but a clump of snow dropped from a branch high above and landed with a soft whoomp. Juniper stood, shook, and came back to my side. I worked through lunch without noticing hunger. Each section I reached had one small correction that saved me time and effort. Brush pulled clear from drainage cuts, loose stones set on the downhill edge where they acted like little breaks for runoff. One half-buried warning post, straightened and packed with firm soil around the base. None of it flashy, none of it random. Every change was the sort of thing a careful trail hand might do if he had strength to spare and no interest in being seen. Curiosity pushed grief out of my chest for a few hours, and the relief of that was so sharp it hurt. At 12:12, I checked in with Dana from a ridge pocket that carried signal. "Status?" she asked. "Main corridor still closed," I said, "but conditions are improving in spots faster than expected." "Faster how?" I watched Juniper nose through sword fern and decided how much plain truth I could send without sounding unfit for duty. "Some obstructions shifted overnight. No equipment sign. I'm documenting." A short pause, then keyboard taps. "Weather settling can move material." "Some, yes." "You sound unconvinced." "I'm saying I can't account for all of it." "All right, send photos when you're back in coverage. Keep it factual." "Always do." When the call ended, I realized my pulse had climbed like I'd been arguing, though we hadn't argued at all. She was right to ask for facts. Facts were what kept people safe. Facts were also getting strange on me. That afternoon, District sent 2 techs up to help clear safe sections near the lower switchbacks. Nolan, who could sharpen a chain in the dark, and Marcy, who trusted clinometers more than weather apps. They arrived in a mud-splashed county truck just after 3. We walked the lower line together, and I showed them the shifted cedar and retied flags without dressing it up. Nolan squatted by the cedar's old position and frowned. No skid marks, no cut rounds, no machine access in this mud. Marcy ran her glove over the bark where a chain would have bitten if anyone had bucked and dragged it. Nothing, not even a scrape line. Nolan stood and looked at me. "You sure this was here yesterday?" "I tagged it at 14:20 yesterday," I said. "Photo timestamps on file." Marcy nodded once. "Then write what we know. Tree moved, cause unknown." I adjusted my hard hat and looked up the trail where fog was beginning to gather in thin bands between trunks. "Write cause unknown and keep cutting the safe sections." "Works for me," Nolan said, and that was that. We put in 2 solid hours, opened a quarter mile, and called it before light dropped. Their truck tail lights disappeared down the forest road, red through mist, and the woods settled back into that layered quiet I had started to recognize. Juniper and I continued another half-mile toward the washout bend so I could flag tomorrow's work. The sky had gone the color of cold steel, and the last light slid low through fir trunks in long, narrow bars. At the bend, the trail crossed a side slope where storm water had eaten a crescent out of the tread. I moved slowly, testing each step with my boot edge, setting one orange flag, then another. Juniper stopped behind me. I turned, expecting her to hesitate on the mud. Instead, she was looking past me, uphill, tail moving once, twice. I followed her line and saw him clearly for the first time. He was crossing the slope in profile about 40 yards away, moving left to right between old fir boles, dark fur catching the last of the light in dull brown bands. He stood taller than any man I had worked with, shoulders broad enough to block a doorway, long arms hanging easy until he reached a leaning trunk. Then, one massive hand came up, palm against bark, and he guided the trunk settle as if lowering a sleeping child into bed. The wood shifted. No crash, no snap, just a controlled slide into stable ground. My knees locked. My hands hung open at my sides. Fear never arrived, and that remains the strangest part to explain. What came instead was an embarrassed kind of awe, like finding out somebody had been quietly helping with your load while you were still insisting you had it handled. He stepped around two young saplings, placing each foot with care in the spaces between roots, and paused when he reached a patch of soft mud. He looked down before he put weight there, changed angle, and took firmer ground to avoid tearing up the edge. I remember every detail because my mind wanted to reject what my eyes were taking in. The shape of his head against the pale fog. The way his fur looked wet at the calves from brush contact. The breadth of his back when he turned slightly down slope. The patience in the movement, no hurry, no display. Just deliberate work done with attention. I heard my own thoughts in a hard, clear line. This cannot fit your old rules. This is still happening. Stay still. Don't crowd the moment with panic. I wanted to run and I wanted to stand there forever, both at once. I knew somehow that I wasn't in danger. Juniper sat down beside my boot and gave a soft huff, almost content. He stopped between two trunks and looked toward us. Not direct challenge, not dominance, just awareness. His eyes were amber brown, even in that dim light, steady and unreadable in any human sense but free of malice. I lifted one hand without planning to, palm out the way I'd greet a skittish horse. My throat worked once before any sound came. "Evening," I said, barely above a whisper. He held that stillness for 3 breaths, then dipped his head a fraction, a small motion that felt like acknowledgement, and turned uphill. He moved deeper into fir shadow, each step quiet for his size, until the trees took him back the way dusk takes color, gradual and complete. I stood there until the cold bit through both gloves. Juniper rose when I did and leaned lightly against my leg. At my feet, in the mud near the flag I had just tied, a print pressed clean and broad, heel deep, toe spread visible at the edge where water hadn't filled yet. I did not cast it. I did not touch it. I only looked, breathing hard and slow, and felt something in me loosen that had been clenched for months. When we finally turned for camp, the trail behind us felt less like a corridor of damage and more like a place where careful hands had been at work all along. I kept my light off for the first 100 yards and let my boots find the tread by memory, one careful step after another, Juniper moving close enough that her shoulder brushed my knee every few strides. I wasn't trying to be dramatic. I just didn't want to flood that stretch of trail with a white beam and turn what had happened into something smaller than it was. Dusk had already thinned to that last iron-blue light, and the fir trunks stood in dark ranks above us while the creek spoke from the draw below, steady and familiar, as if none of this had bent the world at all. Halfway back to camp, I stopped and leaned against a cedar snag because my legs had started to shake. Not from cold, not from the hike, from the effort of holding 2 versions of reality in the same body. In one version, I was Travis Murray, county foreman, hard hat inventory in a spreadsheet, chain files lined up by grit, practical in all weather. In the other, I had just watched a towering, dark-furred being cradle a settling trunk, so it wouldn't slam the slope, then step around saplings like they mattered. Both versions were true, and that was the part my mind kept circling. Juniper sat at my boot and looked up, ears easy. "You saw him too," I said. Her tail tapped wet leaves 3 times, patient as ever with me when I lagged behind the obvious. At camp, I lit the porch lamp, hung my jacket, and went straight to the notebook before I could talk myself out of details. Time, location, weather, estimated distance, movement, behavior, environmental interaction. I wrote until my hand cramped. Then I opened my phone gallery and checked the photos from the day, hoping for anything clear from the bend. I had mud, flagging, one blurred frame of fir trunks where a dark vertical shape might have been bark or might have been him. No proof for anyone else. Enough for me. By 8:10 that night, sleet had started needling the windows, and the stove was running hot enough to click every few seconds. I called Dana from the kitchen window and gave her the parts I could put in official language. "We cleared another quarter-mile lower section," I said. "Upper washout still flagged. Also, that moved cedar at 4.5 is stable where it sits. No secondary slide." "You sound different," she said. "Tired different, not hurt different. You okay?" I watched steam lift off my coffee and made myself stay inside facts. "Long day, good progress. Can you bring in 2 more tomorrow?" "If road holds, yes." "Do it. Board wants a path open for family use before the weekend if we can do it safely." At that, my chest tightened. "Family spur to Ridgeglass Overlook?" "Yeah, that one." "Why?" "My boy might come up," I said, voice low, like saying it too loud could break it. "First time in a while." There was a soft pause, the kind you only hear from people who know when not to fill space. "Then let's give him a decent trail," Dana said. "Send me your hazard list tonight." After I hung up, I stood by the table with the phone in my hand and did not move for a full minute. Then, at 8:27, the screen lit with Eli's name. "Can come Friday morning if road's not iced. Don't make it a big thing." I sat down so hard the chair legs scraped. I read it 3 times, then typed and deleted 5 replies before sending 1 line. "Got it. We'll keep it simple. Glad you're coming." He heart-reacted that message, and that little red icon hit me harder than any long speech could have. The weather came in heavier after midnight. Wind moved down the creek channel in long, damp pushes, and sleet rattled the stovepipe cap with a brittle hiss. I slept in pieces, woke to check the fire, slept again. Each time I woke, I had the same thought. Keep that lower spur clear. Keep your promise small and solid. Don't try to repair 8 months in one afternoon. At some point, staring at the dark rafters, my thoughts shifted into that blunt, present tense voice I get when worry runs deep. I am not asking for miracles. I am asking for one walk with my son where we don't argue and don't perform. I'm asking for 10 honest sentences in a row. I'm asking to be the kind of father who listens all the way through an answer. If the trail is open, we can walk side by side and let the path do some of the work. If it is blocked, he will see me scrambling, apologizing, explaining, and we will slide into old roles before we reach the first switchback. I know wood and slope and weather. I know contingency plans. I do not know how many chances a boy gives his dad when trust has gone thin. I need tomorrow to hold. By 4:30, the sleet had tapered to a wet mist. I gave Juniper her pills in peanut butter, pulled on rain gear over wool, and headed out with a headlamp, wedges, and the short saw. She followed me to the porch and then stopped, favouring her left hip in the cold. "You stay," I told her, kneeling to rub the white fur along her muzzle. "Easy morning. Guard the place." She licked my glove once and settled by the door. The family spur split off ridge glass just past Marker 2, a gentler grade Eli used to call the Pancake Trail, because we always carried a cast iron skillet to the overlook and burned batter on a camp stove. That memory sat warm and painful in me as I climbed. The beam from my headlamp cut through mist and lit the wet edges of salal leaves like tiny mirrors. Water dripped from bent fir boughs in slow, heavy taps. My boots sank past crust into soft mud where the thaw had won overnight. At the bend above the second footbridge, my light caught fresh bark, and I stopped dead. A hemlock had come down square across the spur, trunk thick as a drum, crown tangled in alder on the downhill side, and root ball half torn upslope. It wasn't a clean blowdown I could buck in sections quickly. It sat under tension in two directions with side limbs pinned. One wrong cut alone in that dark and wet would turn the whole mess into a rolling hazard. I stepped around, checked angles, tested mud, and swore under my breath at the geometry of it. The path Eli and I were supposed to walk in 6 hours was sealed shut. I stood there in mist, hands on my hard hat, and felt that old helplessness rush back so hard I had to bend and brace a palm on my knee. Not again, I thought. Not another promise I couldn't keep. Not one more. I tried, with a practical reason attached. I took 2 slow breaths, then keyed my radio. Base, this is Murray at Family Spur. Marker 2.8. New overnight hemlock full block. Repeat full block. Unsafe solo cut in current condition. Requesting 2-person crew and rigging at first light. Static, then dispatch. Copy Murray. Logging request. Earliest wheels out is 0700. Understood. I let go of the transmit button and stared at the trunk. 700 was late. Eli's text said Friday morning, and with him, that could mean any minute after daylight. I clicked off my headlamp and listened, because there was nothing useful left to do in that instant. Mist moved through the trees in slow ribbons. A varied thrush called once, then quieted. Somewhere upslope, a heavy foot settled in mud, with a wet, deliberate press. When I turned, he was there at the edge of the beam's afterglow, about 40 yards out between 2 firs, taller than the understory, dark fur damp at the shoulders where mist clung. He did not advance fast or loom. He stood, watched me, then looked at the downed hemlock. His head turned back to me, and he held that gaze as steady as a man waiting for consent at a gate. I don't know why I did it, except that it felt honest. I stepped back off the tread, lifted both empty hands, and nodded toward the trunk. "If you're here for this," I said, voice rough, "I won't get in your way." He moved then, unhurried and precise, stepping down onto the trail with care not to sink the edge. Each foot placement was chosen, heel to firm ground, toes finding purchase in root seams. At the trunk, he crouched, one hand sliding under bark, the other bracing near a branch collar. Muscles shifted under wet fur across his back and shoulders, broad and controlled, no violent jerk. He tested the load first, easing it just enough to read balance, then reset. The second lift was the real one. The hemlock rose in a smooth arc, not high, just clear, the crown brushing alder tips with a hiss. He pivoted through his hips and stepped backward 3 paces into a shallow hollow off-trail where old stumps held firm soil. He set the trunk down there as carefully as a carpenter lowering a door onto sawhorses. No slam, no slide. Just weight meeting ground with a muted thud that travelled through my boots. I was crying before I understood I was crying. Not loud at first, just tears running cold under my eyes while I stood useless with a saw hanging at my side. He looked at me once, then turned back to the trail and started on the branches. One by one, he carried limb sections from the crown, and laid them along the downhill edge in a low, woven line, a hand-built berm where kids and tired hikers tended to drift wide. He pressed each piece into mud so it held. Where runoff had started to gouge a channel, he set flat stones and packed duff behind them with his palm. It was trail work. Thoughtful, practical, experienced trail work, done by a being no one on payroll would believe. I wiped my face with the heel of my glove and gave a short, shaky laugh that surprised me. "I've been outworked by a giant in the rain," I said to the mist. "Guess that's on my performance review." He paused at that, turned his head, and I would swear his eyes softened, though maybe that was just morning light beginning to rise behind the cloud. When the berm was finished, he stepped back to inspect the line the same way I always did, sighting down grade, checking flow, checking footing. Then he crossed to the first trail post at the spur entrance, knelt and placed something on top. A smooth river stone, palm-sized grey with a white seam through it. He set it centered, stable, deliberate. Only then did he look at me directly. "Thank you," I whispered, and this time the words came from a place in me that had been shut for a long while. "For the trail, for all of it." He held my gaze, amber-brown and calm, then gave that same small tilt of the head I had seen at the washout bend, a quiet acknowledgement that asked for nothing back. He stepped backward off the tread, one pace, then another, letting the fir shadows gather around him until his outline dissolved into trunk and mist, and the forest took him in without drama. I stood in the reopened spur with rain ticking softly through branches, radio silent at my chest, and watched dawn lift from slate to pale silver. The path ahead was clear enough for a father and son to walk side by side. I stayed on that reopened spur and let the rain soak through my hat brim, because moving felt like lying. My chest was hitching in uneven pulls, not neat crying, not cinematic, just the kind that comes when you've held too much for too long, and your body decides it's done cooperating with your pride. I set the saw down in the mud, put both hands on my knees, and tried to breathe around the ache in my throat. The berm he had built curved along the edge in a clean, useful line, better than half the rushed crew jobs I'd signed off on in fair weather. That broke me all over again. For months I had been carrying anger because anger was easier to stack and label than grief. Angry at court dates, angry at polite advice, angry at a phone that stayed quiet, angry at myself for every sentence I wished I could reword after it left my mouth. Out there in wet fir light, with a path cleared by hands that owed me nothing, all that anger drained off like runoff finding a ditch. What stayed was simpler and harder. I missed my kid. I was scared I had taught him that love always came with pressure. I was tired of being a man who knew how to keep strangers safe on a trail, but couldn't make his own son feel safe picking up the phone. I had called that practical realism. Standing there, it looked more like fear with a tool belt on. I told myself this couldn't be real, then watched water bead and roll off the stone on the trail post, and understood reality was not asking my permission. The print nearest me held fresh water in the heel cup. The mud around it showed the edge of fur drag at one toe where he had pivoted with weight, then stepped light to avoid chewing up the tread. Every detail was plain as any worksite sign-off. I took my notebook from my jacket, hands still shaking, and wrote what I saw in block letters so I couldn't later claim memory had embellished it. Trunk removed to stable hollow, side branches placed as safety berm, drainage armoured with flat rock, trail post marked with smooth riverstone. I underlined marked once and closed the book before my pen tore the page. My radio crackled at my chest, sharp in that soft morning. "Murray, this is base. You copy? Crew wheels can roll at 0700 for your hemlock report." I wiped my face with a wet glove and keyed up. Base Murray. Hold that crew. Repeat, hold. Obstruction at 2.8 is resolved. A pause then. Resolved by what means? I looked down the trail, clear and passable, and chose the words I could stand behind. Unknown means overnight. Trunk is off tread in a stable position. Edge reinforced. I'll do final safety walk and send photos. Another pause. Longer this time. Copy. Resolved overnight. Unknown means. Send documentation before 0800. You sure you're okay out there? Yeah, I said. And for once it wasn't a placeholder. I'm okay. I clipped the radio back and laughed once through the last of the tears. You just saved me from a paperwork funeral, and I'm still going to have to fill out 3 forms, I muttered to the trees. If you're listening, I'm sorry in advance for government prose. It was a ridiculous sentence to offer a 9-foot mystery in the rain, and it helped. My breathing settled, my hands steadied. I picked up the saw, slung it, and started walking the spur from top to bottom like I did after every storm fix. By the time daylight climbed from silver to a thin, colourless grey, I had checked footing every 20 paces and tested each berm section with my boot. Nothing shifted. The branch weave held. Water was already choosing the channel instead of spilling over the edge. At the hollow where he had set the hemlock, the trunk rested snug against old stumps, just as I'd seen. No strain points aimed at the trail. No widowmakers hung above it. This was not random strength. This was judgment. I stood there a minute with one hand on wet bark and felt gratitude move through me without embarrassment this time. On the walk back toward camp, the woods resumed their ordinary morning voices in layers. A jay complained from the ridge. 2 chickadees stitched quick calls through alder. The creek ran louder with fresh melt, and wind moved high in the canopy in long, soft sweeps. Nothing announced departure, no dramatic sign, no final display. The presence that had filled those hours had simply eased away and left function behind. That quiet exit did something to me. It felt like being trusted with a secret you weren't expected to profit from. At the split near Marker 2, I stopped and turned uphill once more. I won't chase you, I said, low and plain. I won't bring people up here looking to prove themselves. I'll keep it respectful. The promise felt binding in a way signatures never had. I waited, not for an answer, just to make sure I meant it. A branch tipped somewhere deep in fir shadow, then stilled. That was all. I touched 2 fingers to the brim of my hat, an old habit from thanking volunteers, and headed down. Juniper was on the porch when I reached the cabin, stiff but upright, tail beating the boards hard enough to rattle the coffee can by the door. She sniffed my soaked pants, my gloves, my sleeves, then pressed her head into my thigh with a soft grunt, like she had been waiting to confirm something. I knelt slow, arms around her neck, and she licked rain and salt off my cheek with no dignity at all. Yeah, I told her, forehead against her warm fur. Yeah, girl, we're all right. Inside, I stripped wet layers by the stove and set the riverstone on the table, where morning light from the east window could catch the white seam through it. It looked ordinary enough to pass in any creek bed, and specific enough that I knew I'd find it in a pile of 1,000. I took photos of the cleared spur, the relocated trunk, the berm, the armoured drainage, and the print near the post. Then I sent Dana a short packet with coordinates and 1 line in the report field. Blockage resolved overnight. Unknown means. Trail passable after inspection at 0642. I did not embellish, and I did not omit what mattered for safety. Her reply came 3 minutes later. Good work, logging as you wrote it. Keep an eye on stability after thaw. No follow-up questions, no lecture. Just trust in my field judgment, which felt like mercy. I brewed fresh coffee, fed Juniper, and cleaned mud from my boots at the sink while the cabin warmed. My hands still trembled now and then, little aftershocks. Each time they did, I looked at the stone and remembered those steady eyes and that slight nod. The memory did not spike my nerves. It settled them. I had spent so long believing care only counted if it was negotiated, documented, and witnessed by 3 parties. Out there, I had been helped in silence, with precision, then left to carry the meaning myself. A primary part of me, the hard defensive part, had finally unclenched. At 7:22, my phone buzzed on the table. Eli, leaving now. Roads look wet, not iced. Be there around 9. I read it once, then again, thumb hovering before I answered. Thanks, I'll have coffee hot. Pancake trail is open. The 3 dots appeared, vanished, then came back. Okay. I set the phone down carefully, like it might bruise, and stood at the window over the sink. Mist was lifting off the creek in pale sheets. The spur entrance sat just visible through the trees. Clean line, no obstruction. I did not ask for another sign. I did not go looking at the tree line for a silhouette. The gift was already complete. A passable path, a stone on a post, and enough peace in my chest to meet my son without pleading or performance. I carried the stone to the shelf above the stove where Eli used to line up his creek finds, set it in the center, and left space on either side. I stepped back from the shelf and looked at that space like I was laying out tools for a job I wanted to do right the first time. The stone sat in the middle, damp still, white seam angled towards the window. On impulse, I took the coffee can from by the door, brought the 3 porch sticks to the table, and lined them beside my notebook. Then I opened the notebook to the first odd entry and read straight through, from kindling present at 10:40 hours to resolved overnight. Unknown means. Every page smelled faintly of wet wool and cedar from my jacket pocket. I tore out nothing. I softened nothing. I wrote one more line at the bottom of the morning's page. Eli due around 0900. Keep it simple. Listen more than you talk. At 8:30, I mixed pancake batter in the same dented bowl we had used years earlier. And when I poured the first round onto the cast iron skillet, I burned it on one side and laughed in spite of myself. Juniper supervised from her rug with the serious expression of a foreman who had concerns about quality control. The second one came out better. I set 2 on a plate, covered them with a towel, then checked the road from the porch every few minutes without admitting that was what I was doing. I stood there with my hands around a warm mug and my heart knocking harder than it had during any saw cut that week. My mind started its old churn, and I let it run until it emptied. I told myself this couldn't be handled with perfect words because nothing important ever was. I wanted to run through explanations, apologies, legal details, all the polished things adults use when they're scared. I wanted to tell him I had done my best, and I knew how weak that could sound to a kid who mostly needed me present. I knew this much, at last. If he said one true thing, I had to make room for it. If he was angry, I had to stand still and hear it. If he was quiet, I had to stop filling silence with strategy. I could clear deadfall all day. Today, the work was smaller and harder. Don't force, don't defend. Stay open. At 9:07, I heard tires on wet gravel. Juniper got up too fast, slipped once, recovered, and huffed at herself. Eli's friend's old pickup rolled into the turnout, and Eli climbed out in a grey hoodie, taller than when I'd last seen him in person. Shoulders broader, face still boy and not boy at the same time. He paused by the truck door, hands in his pockets. "Hey," he said. "Hey, bud." I kept my voice level and walked down the steps without rushing him. "Road okay?" Mostly slush, couple icy patches in shade. He looked past me at the cabin, then at Juniper. She reached him first, pressing her head into his thigh, tail thudding like she had found a missing piece of furniture and approved the room again. He scratched her ears and gave the smallest smile. She's old. So am I said, and he snorted once, quick and real. Inside, steam from the skillet fogged the lower corners of the window. Eli sat at the table, drank coffee with too much sugar like he always had when he wanted to feel grown, and ate 2 pancakes without talking much. I let the quiet be quiet. After a while, he set his fork down and looked at his hands. "Mom says you're better when you're up here," he said. "I'm steadier up here," I answered. "Better is a bigger claim." He glanced up, measuring me. "You going to make this into a speech?" "No." I shook my head. "We can just walk if you want." He nodded once. "Yeah, let's walk." By the time we reached the spur split, the mist had lifted into thin strips, and daylight came through the firs in pale gold slants. Water still dripped from branch tips, tapping the mud in a slow rhythm. Eli walked half a step ahead, hands in his hoodie pocket, looking around like he was letting old memories and new distance negotiate terms. Juniper followed at her own pace, nose busy, satisfied to be included. At the first trail post, he stopped. "That stone new?" I looked at the grey river stone sitting centered where I had left it. "Yeah." He touched it with 2 fingers, turned it slightly, then let it rest. "Looks like one I had up here. White line through the middle." "You did have one like that," I said. "You kept it on the shelf till you were 11. He gave me a side look. "You remember that?" "I remember most of it, even what I don't deserve to." That landed between us without breaking anything. We kept moving. When we reached the cleared hemlock site, Eli stopped again and stared at the hollow where the trunk now rested. The branch berm curved along the edge, firm and neat. "You did this morning?" he asked. "I inspected it this morning," I said. "I didn't do the heavy part." He looked at the trunk, then at me. "Who did?" I took a breath and chose plain truth. "I saw someone in these woods this week, big as a shed, careful as a nurse. He's been moving things, fixing what he can. Last night he cleared this." I tapped my chest once. "I know how that sounds." Eli didn't laugh. He crouched by the berm, pressed a palm to one of the branches set into mud, and tested how solid it was. "This is good work," he said. "Whoever did it knew runoff." "Yeah," I said. "He did." We walked another 1/4 mile and came to the overlook where the trees opened to the valley, cloud shadow moving over distant ridges. I set the skillet on the camp stove and burned 1 pancake again. Eli watched me, then took the spatula out of my hand. "You always flip too early," he said. "I've had years to improve and didn't." "That tracks." He cooked the next one perfectly. We stood shoulder to shoulder with warm pancakes in paper towels, breathing cold air and watching hawks circle low over the draw. Then he said, still looking out, "I stopped answering because every call felt like a test. Like if I said the wrong thing, we'd go right back to court talk." I kept my eyes on the ridgeline and answered slowly. "I did that. Not on purpose, but I did. I'm sorry, Eli." He nodded, jaw tight. "I know you love me. I just got tired of feeling managed." "That makes sense." My throat tightened, but my voice held. "I can do better than managed. I want to." He took a breath and let it out hard. "Okay, then don't do the 12 text thing if I don't answer in 20 minutes. Deal. And don't ask me what your lawyer should do." "Done." He finally looked at me straight on. "And if I say I'm mad, don't tell me I'm just stressed." I nodded. "I can hear mad." We stood there while the stove hissed and Juniper snored against my boot. Nothing flashy happened. No soundtrack moment. Just two people making room where there hadn't been room. On the way back down, he pointed at a softened depression near the edge of tread, where rain had blurred the outline but not erased the depth. That a print? It was clearer at dawn, I said. I left it alone. Why? Didn't feel like mine to collect. He considered that, then said, Yeah, I get that. By late afternoon, after Eli left with a quick one-armed hug that turned into a full one when I held still, I drove to the district shed to file hard copies and return borrowed rigging we never used. Dana met me at the workbench with my photo packet open on her tablet. Nolan and Marcy were there too, drinking burnt coffee from paper cups. Dana tapped the screen. Board accepted the status update. Official line is resolved overnight. Unknown means. Family Spur reopened with caution signage. They want your inspection notes attached. Already printed, I said, handing her the folder. Marcy looked at the berm photos, then at me, one eyebrow raised. Unknown means has cleaner edge work than some contractors. Nolan gave a low whistle at the trunk in the hollow. No machine track, no cut rounds. Still weird. It's still weird, I agreed. Dana held my gaze a second longer than usual. Not pushing, just checking. Anything else I need for safety planning? I thought about stillness. The calm deer, the scent in cold air, flags retied at shoulder height. Cedar moved uphill, juniper's easy tail at the tree line. I thought about the parts that could be entered in a county system and the parts that could not. You need to know someone out there was careful with our trail, I said. No damage added, risks reduced. That's what I can give you. She nodded. Then that's what we'll use. No one asked me to perform disbelief for their comfort. No one demanded a confession to machinery that wasn't there. We finished paperwork, logged tool returns, and closed the file with the language we had from the start. Unknown means. That evening, back at the cabin, I put the notebook, printed photos and dispatch logs in a plastic file box, labelled Ridge Glass, Blowdown 2026, and slid it under the bunk where dry things stayed dry. The 3 sticks went into the same box in a zip bag with the date. The coffee can went back by the door empty. Evidence accounted for. Nothing hidden, nothing marketed. On the shelf above the stove, the river stone sat centered in its place. And before bed, I noticed Eli had added 2 small creek rocks on either side of it, while I was loading his truck. I live mostly the same way now. I still sharpen chains at noon. I still trust weather reports, time cards, and good boots. I still fill out forms in complete sentences and hate meetings that run long. The difference is not that I became a different species of man. The difference is that my framework widened. I no longer confuse what I can measure with all that is real. I call Eli and leave one message, then wait. He calls back more often than not. When he doesn't, I don't turn silence into a verdict. Some weekends he comes up and we walk the pancake trail, and we talk in plain, halting sentences that hold. At dusk, if Juniper and I stand by the tree line and the woods go briefly still, I lift a hand and say evening to the fir shadows. I don't ask for another sighting. I don't need one. A path was blocked. Then it was cleared with strength and gentleness in the same motion. I was given help I could not demand and peace I could not engineer. I carry that the way I carry a good knife, quietly, every day.